Every year, thousands of tourists journey down the River Nile, seeking out the wonders of ancient Egypt. Luxury cruises bring those who can afford it from the Valley of Kings down to Abu Simbel and the rainbow-coloured villages of the Nubian people. But these villages are anything but ancient. Most of the sites which the Nubians have inhabited for almost 4,000 years were destroyed in the 1950s. These villages that tourists see today have only been around since the 1970s. Underneath this lake, just next to modern Aswan, lie the true ancestral lands of millions of people, still fighting for their rights and culture. Nubian people have inhabited southern Egypt and northern Sudan for more than 4,000 years. Like indigenous peoples all over the world, their community has been bisected by state lines and forced off its land by the development projects of a country that they never asked to join. The Aswan Low Dam and the Aswan High Dam were built to harness the hydroelectric power of the Nile and control its unpredictable floodwaters. The result was one of the largest man-made lakes in the world, Lake Nasser, which flooded traditional Nubian lands. By 1970, more than 50,000 Egyptian Nubians had been forced away. Some were moved into temporary housing, many miles from the banks of the Nile. Decades later, their descendants are still there, waiting for the return that they were promised. Others fled to Luxor, Cairo, Alexandria, and other major cities across Egypt looking for work. Families were ripped apart. Census data in Egypt is dicey at best, disrupted by revolutions, corruption-induced inefficiency, and a neglect to include data about the Nubians at all. But activists estimate that millions of ethnic Nubians are now scattered across the country, usually working poorly paid lower-class jobs. After forcibly displacing them from their homeland, the Egyptian government has worked hard to relegate the remaining Nubians in Aswan to a relic of the past. Those that remain in what's left of Old Núbia, the poor villages around Aswan, are permitted to do so because they generate tourism income for the government. As with indigenous communities across the world, the Nubian people of Egypt have been placed in the past, systematically depicted as ancient relics, rather than as a living, breathing people. While people deserve rights, land, and self-determination, relics are owed none of these things. Ancient, inanimate objects are better suited to museums, National Geographic documentaries, and of course, attracting wealthy tourists. All Aswan tourism websites highlight Nubian villages alongside dead, inhuman sites like the statue of Abu Simbel, encouraging tourists to visit, take pictures, and enjoy the journey into the past. One of the more stylish tourist websites of Aswan writes, "Nubians are friendly and hospitable. They often invite you to their homes for a cup of tea or to taste their unique shamsi bread. After such hospitality, a reciprocal gesture of generosity is not necessary, but it would certainly be appreciated." Despite the government's attempts to erase the Nubian people's rights to their ancestral land, a new generation of Nubian activists are bringing the fight back to life. In 2014, Egypt's new constitution acknowledged for the first time the Nubians' right of return, promising resettlement within 2 years. But nearly 3 years later, the government has made no move towards a concrete plan. Instead, in October 2015, President Sisi announced a massive land reclamation project, aiming to expand Egypt's agricultural land by 20% by reclaiming land that includes Nubian territory for government use. In 2016, the government announced that it was putting indigenous Nubian land up for sale. Nubian human rights defenders say that this was a step too far. In November, hundreds of protesters in Aswan staged a Nubian caravan, driving dozens of cars towards indigenous Nubian land, determined to return home. Headed for the territory that their grandparents were displaced from half a century ago, human rights defenders like Mohamed Azmi, Ayat Osman, Ibrahim Mohammed, Seham Osman, and Hossam Abdelatif led more than 200 Nubians straight into a military checkpoint, separating the Nubian people from their indigenous land. Since the caravan reignited Nubian demands to return home, government persecution of Nubian rights defenders has intensified. Activists report surveillance, threats, and intimidation as they work to plan another caravan. In a severe escalation, the government arrested 6 Nubian activists in early January, sending a clear message to human rights defenders that further protests would not be tolerated. Less than a week later, Egyptian intelligence in Aswan called 15 members of the Nubian Union to a meeting and presented them with 7 demands, threatening the union with an asset freeze or closure if they didn't abide. demand number 5 said that the Nubians' renowned union leader, human rights defender Mohammed Azmi, must resign.
مسؤول المخابرات الحربية في أسوان هنا استدعى تقريبا عدد كبير من القيادات النوبية بيحاول يقنعهم ان محمد عزمي لازم يمشي لأن محمد عزمي بيهدد الأمن القومي المصري.
3 days later, the Nubian Union voted once again for Azmi to be their leader. It's no mystery why the government seems so nervous about the newest generation of Nubian rights defenders. They're creative, refuse to quit, and are disrupting the historic, inanimate Nubian narrative that the government works so hard to sell to tourists.
أنا الأول كنت فاكرة إن هم منفصلين عن بعض، ما لهمش علاقة ببعض، بس أنا من ممارستي بقى وشغلي هنا وإن أنا ممكن أكون في الجنوبية ويجيلي اجتماع في الاتحاد أو في حاجات كتيرة تقاطعت مع بعض. الستات كمان، مشاركة الستات اللي من تشكى الكبار دول معانا في القافلة كان بالنسبة لي حاجة كويسة جدا. فلما رحنا فتحنا الكمين ودخلنا بالعافية يعني، وكان في مشادات ساعتها. ده بالنسبة لي برضو كان إحساس مختلف إن الستات الكبار دول معانا وبيتخانقوا معانا وإحنا عرفنا نوصل الموضوع ده هناك.
بس أنا يعني نشاطي في القضية مش نشاط رئيس اتحاد أو غيره، أنا من قبل نشاطي كرئيس اتحاد أنا كنت بشتغل بشكل منفصل وبشكل مفرط، فأنا مش هعرف نكمل.